Hello and welcome to another episode of Speculative Speculations. I'm Varsha.
Carl. I'm Chris.
And I am Jared.
And this is a series where we talk about speculative stories in all their forms. We are currently working our way through Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. This is the third discussion. We are talking about an origin for Sonmi 451, 541, one of those, and Sluicious Crossing and everything that comes after those two sections. We'll be working our way back down to the stories we just came here from next week, although we haven't talked about which parts, either the next two or the next three. We'll decide afterwards. I'll probably post it in the description.
I have put a reading schedule on the website for which parts
you
to come
have?
next.
Okay,
Yes.
excellent. Thank you. And I also did not look up the short story for next week, but Chris did, I'm sure. No?
I did. I have it listed again in the schedule, in the Cloud Atlas reading schedule, so if anybody wants to know, it's all there. With even, well, there would be a link if I can find a link to it, but it is The Squid Chooses Its Own Ink by Adolfo Bioy Casares.
Oh, that sounds awesome. I loved this week's story, but we'll talk about it when we get there.
And if
But
I
today's
find
story...
a link to it, I shall post it to it, like for the other stories.
Thank you, Chris. And today's short story is The Astronaut by Valentina I don't know how to say it.
Zhuravlyova.
Yeah.
Maybe.
that last name. I need to see it in front of me to pronounce it. I don't have it at the moment, but yes, these two short stories are from the Big Book of Science Fiction. We are working our way through that slowly and steadily. With all that said, I think we got to, for me, the hardest part of Cloud Atlas to read because of the dropped letters and the different words that were used for various things. And in fact, I think the language changed even for the origin section with all the exact, everything that starts with EX changed to X. That was maybe the only thing I noticed, but I'm sure there were others. So, what did you guys think of the clone interview?
I found it honestly really hard to read. Like, I had to really focus with it. Everything from the dropping the E at the beginning of those X words to, using like Disney's to refer to like movies in general. And like, there were just a lot of slang words like there are in a lot of cyberpunk fiction, which this was clearly evoking. And so there was a lot of kind of piecing together all of that. And it was also just very dry. So that I think made it a little harder for me to emotionally invest in what was going on. But I got there eventually. And certainly by the end, I was excited to see what came next.
Interesting. By far and away my favorite of the stories.
Oh, really?
You are right in terms, like, I think this is true of every short story, Carl, in this or its format, etc. The first 10 to 15 pages of every single one of these stories takes, there's like a period where you need to get antiquated with the language. You need to almost kind of like go into a country and kind of getting yourself settled in the way that it is. And sometimes, like, I started off the first 10, 15 pages going, oh, this book's falling off a cliff for me. It's like harder and harder to read all the time. But it sort of picked up pace the way through, and by the end I was just like, well, that's a proper cliffhanger. That's not like the Louisa Ray one where she goes off the cliff, where you kind of think, well, only one of two things is going to happen. Either she's dead or she's not dead. In this one, it's like, right, well, what actually is going on? Because it is an intrigue kind of thing in much the same way, and it sort of expands on the themes of the Louisa Ray story in its own right, and that kind of government conspiracy and all of that kind of stuff as we go through that. But yeah, that's interesting because I thoroughly enjoyed the clone story.
Interesting. Yeah, I liked. I think you brought up the cyberpunk aspect, Kyle, and I can tell that he was trying to evoke that kind of atmosphere with the language and the references to our present, basically, being a thing like a quaint past of some sort that
like calling movies Disney's instead of movies, kind of like, the vernacular took over instead of movies. The way they probably, like the way the term movie might have been, it might have been
Moving
called a
picture.
picture show way back when, so it, that kind of thing is fascinating and it's interesting. I did have a hard time getting into it, because, that interview style there, where it's an interrogation basically, um, it doesn't really lend one to be like excited, like, oh right, I want to read more of this. There's no, it's so practical. It lacks lyricism because of that. But I think once you finally get to know the character a little bit, and you finally get to see her beyond the confines that she was brought up in, then it starts getting interesting, and I started like, okay, what's going to happen now? Because now we're breaking out of the I'm just a clone mold. I'm just basically a slave because I'm a clone. We're breaking out of that mold, and we're getting to discover the rest of the world with her. And that made it more interesting at that point. So, Chris, you're right. Like the first 10 pages or so was just like, oh boy. And then once we got out of that and we got into the she's discovering the world along with us, it got a lot more interesting. Once again, I got to praise Mitchell's ability to just totally transform his writing into a different tone and different atmosphere. And so that was just fascinating to look at in and of itself. Um, it's what a quirky book this is.
Yeah.
That's a very nice way to put it. I like that. Yeah.
Reading this book is humbling. It really is. I'm just continuously impressed, awe-inspired, frankly, at David Mitchell's ability to write in a completely different voice. And not just to write in a completely different voice, but to even come up with different structural approaches to his prose, to do this interview style was incredible. Like I while it wasn't necessarily my favorite in the moment, but like to like think of that, to come up with these conceits for each of these stories, and each one is different. So they all have that, they not only have their like genre flavor, there's like an extra layer of novelty to each of them, in terms of just how they're structured, how the story is told to you. And it continues with the next section. We'll get to it. But I was blown away. And really, now that we've seen kind of the breadth of the voices that he writes in, and I have to say that part of why I struggled with this was because I realized it kind of clicked for me as you were talking about it, Jared, because it definitely opened up for me when the world opened up. And I think I'm someone who really struggles with like slave narratives. Like I find the whole notion of like being a slave, like it's just like very like bleak to me. For some reason, there's a lot of like horrible things that I can look past, but like being a slave is just one that for some reason I don't enjoy reading it. Like it's just really upsetting to me. And she's really effectively a slave, in the opening. And that kind of continues, but like she has more freedom later on, and she kind of develops more. I think the word they use is ascends, which is a really interesting choice for her awakening. And the beginning did have like intrigue, everything with the other clone, ascending and dying in it's not even really a terrorist. Like she doesn't really do anything. She's just trying to escape. But that's how they treat it, right? Is as like a terrorist attack. And then on top of all that, like the best cyberpunk, it really does reflect back on kind of our present circumstances. And, for a lot of different reasons, I found reading all of that very upsetting and hard to read, and kind of the corpocracy, you know, that was just, it's the sort of, I don't know if satire is the right word, but sociopolitical commentary that is so meaningful and prescient and, frankly painful, particularly as we are in a period of, I think, extreme uncertainty around the globe, but certainly in the United States. And it's just, it hit. Anyway, I've been rambling for a while.
Well, Vasha.
Yeah, I think excuse me. Yeah, the slave bits were definitely difficult to read, and I think I agree with parts of what all of you said. They, for not just this story, but all of them, I think took me a while to get interested in. But once I got interested in, it was almost like hooked about like where this is going, and there is of course the background question of how this all ties back together with the previous stories and all the other stories, right? We do have a bit of a hook, like each time one of those previous stories is mentioned, like with Sonmi in this case talking about the Disney that was the ghastly ordeal of Timothy Cavendish. So there is always that, and so these stories are connected, and there's also the angle of previous births, maybe with the repetition of the comet, what is it, birthmark, which we find out Sonmi has. So when those parts come in, those are always, they feel like really tiny things to get hooked on, but actually they're not, because that's what sort of pulls the story forward for me and makes me want to like immediately go on to the next section, which is something I almost never do, because short stories and character changes I struggle with, and I have to put the book down and mentally prepare myself to come back and read about a different character than the one we were just following. So with all that, yeah, the stories individually, they seem to be very theme driven, to borrow Carl's terminology, like with the corpocracy. I don't know if I got, so the first time I read this story was I was back home in India, so the Papa song mapping to Papa John's maybe, and like all the pizzerias and eateries. I don't know if I sort of caught it. And they have these big men, the simulation that she realizes, like when she's had her world open up to her and she comes back and sees just how much they had them fooled. I think all of those were brilliant. And and I think what was really, I guess, gut wrenching was when she has a conversation with someone about how big the world is, and she says, well, if there are other people like me or whatever, like I forget what the specifics were, but she's challenging the person talking to her, like, why didn't I see them in my journey from there to here in all this distance? I didn't see them. And they're like, how big do you think the world is? Let's go upstairs and I'll show you just how big, and this, what you're looking at, is nothing. So yeah, it had, I think, this wonderful flow to it. And I think this it is a very interesting book because I have to, none of the stories individually, I think, again, are brilliant or excellent on their own, but somehow the fact that they tie it all together, they have this incredible forward momentum that that I've been trying to decipher from like the second story on. But yeah, and I enjoy epistolary fiction, so I liked the interview format, and also yeah, I think that's it. That's my summary. I rambled, but that is it.
It's quite interesting hearing everybody talk about this, because I think there's some. It's a book that I can't say I love yet. I'm sort of in it for the journey, but do I? Am I dying about it? No, because I don't think you can, because other than obviously its impressive nature, as you quite rightly say, in terms of like prose style and voice and location, and how very seamlessly it seems to be interweaves between these sections. I don't know enough about what's going on here, other than having those little seeds of intrigue that, as you say, Varsha, just draw you along. There's like the slave narrative. Well, say this book and the next one. This book became unbelievably political very, very quickly. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. At the start, I was like, "Oh, am I just reading into this because of the state of the world today, or is he actually making a lot of points?" And I think very clearly, by the time you get the next story, you see climate change, etc., and everything's on the table here. But the slavery is worse because it's almost another of a lower class where they've been conditioned to think a certain way and they can't think outside the box. Their experience is so limited that they believe what they've been told. Like this, after the 12th, isn't it 12th, isn't it? Year that they ascend, they literally go up in an elevator, as in this story, when they go to ascend the two robots, and like some of it's really on the nose, but that othering of people and how our clone is treated when they go into the research institute, etc., and sit in the lecture theatre and all of that kind of stuff is very upsetting to read in much the same way as Parable of Talents was very disturbing to read, but the slave sections in there as well, like they are difficult sections, and I think very much Mitchell was banking on that a lot, because that is a period of history that could and should never be repeated, and yet history just has a way of having these things come back round, and it's almost like a warning to kind of repulse you, to say, look, this isn't right, you know?
Yeah. Cyberpunk stories, they always feel like they're about the present, I mean, in a way that like a lot of sci-fi is, and I think you could argue a lot of just fiction is in general.
Yeah.
But like, Cyberpunk is dealing with, kind of the most extreme versions of the systems we live with every day. And that makes it, much more immediately political and impactful. And, what was disturbing to me was a lot of the ways in which, like you said, kind of older history was repeated in this new environment, where like the one that comes to mind immediately that I loved was how all the clones were kind of kept docile with what they called soap,
So
which is this
yeah.
drug, right? Which classically evokes how so many laborers in history, I think of miners in the West in like the 19th century were given booze to essentially, keep them docile and, quiet and content, to work the like most backbreaking, horrible, jobs where they would, have short life expectancies and all that sort of thing. It's just, it's brutal, and it's bleak, and I will say, for all as difficult as the slave narrative is for me, inevitably when the character kind of breaks out of that is always very cathartic. And Somni, I think, is probably the most likable of all the characters we read so far. Like I loved her, and I am so sad to know that she is going to be made into a Christ figure, and be crucified, and yet again ascend in a
That's true.
manner of speaking, right? As we find out in the next section, which I loved. That was another bit I loved. But God, it was heavy stuff. And I love the little kind of quiet love story brewing, in the background. That was something I really appreciated. I loved the quirky professor. That's like always like quirky mentor figures. Like I'm always here for. I love the eccentric wizard trope. Like I'm here for it. And I just enjoyed all of that.
Yeah, and Mitchell's even throughout all that, he still manages to throw in these little things where he's making this statement, and he's done this in some of the earlier stories, where he's making this statement that art is important.
Yeah.
It's very important, especially when she sees the movies, the Disneys from earlier time
that have been banned and controlled as well. Again, this restriction of access to art and books and stories and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, but where she says, when you're present in the movie, it's the true illusion. The movies seem to say, for 50 minutes, for the first time since my ascension, I forgot myself utterly ineluctably, whatever that means. Uh, but she but that was like, that just speaks to the power of art to move us and to bring us something greater than where we are in the present. And he's mentioned that kind of uplifting of art in, of course, with the music with Cavendish and the and some other things, and a couple of the other stories that really, he throws those little points home. Not Cavendish wasn't the music. Who was it? That was Frobisher. Frobisher.
Frobisher,
Yeah.
Robert Frobisher.
Cavendish was the publisher. Yeah.
Publisher.
And but he mentioned, writing in that one, and so I just like how these little things, these little thematic seams of hope for art in general to lift people up beyond their circumstances.
Absolutely.
There's a couple of really interesting themes, I think, aside from those ones that you mentioned, especially in these two stories, but I think you can sort of tail it back to the other four before it. This kind of thirst for knowledge, and this idea that knowledge acquisition is really important. Obviously, it's very much part of their development, aside from the drug or the enhancement of the soap, but also for the second character in that story as well, and also about the importance of story. And about parable as a way for passing knowledge on from generation to generation, or kind of doing that through stories, because the world in each of these stories has moved on significantly progression wise. There's very significant changes in the structure of the world, the way how it's going, but the stories are like a throughput, whether it's somebody picking something off a shelf like earlier on in the story, watching a movie, or like we'll get on to probably in the last part, this kind of parable kind of thing of taking much more complex ideas and distilling them down to legends. And then it almost comes full circle. Like, it's very far future, but it's almost recursively the whole way back in a lot of ways. So yeah, it's very, very clever in that way.
Yeah.
I also like this theme or idea that this brings up, which I think came up in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and in some of Lavi Tidar stories that I've read. She's a clone, but she's been enslaved. So I think just because she's been fabricated, I think that that gives us the right to enslave them. If they have, if an entity has scope for sentience, I think the discussion of allowing them to use their free will is important. And I don't know, I've been riled up about that recently. I saw a video by Sabine Hossenfender when she talked about a Canadian company that apparently wants to use quantum computing to create sentient AI, and I'm like, to what end are we going to go through this cycle of deciding that? I don't know. I don't think we're anywhere close to succeeding, but let's say we do. What are you going to do with it other than maybe enslave and then use them until, like, how long do we need to go through that discussion of morality? Anyway, I think that's really important, and it keeps coming up in a lot of the sci-fi stories. And
The
this
Wind
one
Up Girl
also,
too.
yeah, Wind Up Girl
Yeah,
too.
that's right.
Yes, yeah, and I think this dealt with that very interestingly. Again, it reminds me of another story also, but I won't say which one because we don't find out for a long time that they're clones in that story. So you know which one, Chris?
Well, there's lots of there was lots of
Okay.
stories that came to my mind about that.
Okay.
But again, in some of them, it's very much a spoiler.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
It is always a powerful narrative choice, right? I mean, I have a cyberpunk story brewing in my brain about like kind of clones similarly being dehumanized and used in a war effectively, and I think whether it's clones or like AI or whatever, and the worst part of it is that is exactly how humans would treat them. Like I can distinctly remember being a senior in high school and reading a short story. And I can't remember the title of it. I can't remember the author at this point. It was basically about this guy who adopted this robot boy because he and his wife couldn't have kids. And the robot boy ends up dying, and there's a lot of talk about like free will and humanity and like souls and whatnot, and the basic conclusion that everyone except me and actually my best friend, who is also in the same class, came to was that this robot was not sapient, didn't have the sort of agency of humanity. It has no soul. It is no better than a toaster, was what one person said. Like a lot of these were classmates who I like thought were like very kind and compassionate people, but who so easily could brush off the notion that this, artificially the robot, is a term that means slave. So I don't want to use the term robot, but I guess AI is maybe the catch-all, right? That it deserved freedom, it deserved life, that like its death was a tragedy. And, certainly I think the question is kind of where that line is. And, you could extend this question out into like animals and how animals are treated, although certainly I think we try to at least be more humane is the word we use with animals. And I think this book is very concerned with it. As we get into next with like the difference between civilized and savage and what that like really means, right?
It's interesting you brought up souls, Kyle, because there was one section where she had to have a soul implanted in her in order to get into the campus, and I was like, that's an interesting idea that Mitchell puts out there, but I don't know if he really explained what exactly that contains or how that's determined.
I think it's a computer. I think it's like a computer that functions as like a credit card and like an entrance card. Like it's basically like if you had your phone implanted in your neck.
So it's a program that tells whatever's monitoring people,
right,
that this is a person.
Yeah,
exactly.
So okay,
exactly.
Because I was just like, wait a minute, a soul implant, and I got to remember that's from her point of view, so she doesn't know any better that it's not a soul per se. But exactly, it was interesting, yeah.
Talking about like notions of like reincarnations and like the idea, which I feel like unless someone can introduce me to some version of reincarnation that I am not aware of, but like a kind of fundamental assumption, if reincarnation is a thing, is that souls are real and that they can be, passed along. And so if this clone has a soul, then presumably, the woman she's cloned from does not have the same soul. So it doesn't have the birthmark. Like, I don't know if this is thematically relevant, or
Right.
I mean, I'm sure it is, but like certainly in terms of kind of the story being told, I'm very curious to see if the source material, you could say, so the source genes comes.
Well, I think that question is raised in the next story as a springboard for the rest of the book. And I think because of the Prescients don't believe in souls, whereas the Waylanders do, and I think that's a very interesting distinction, especially when we discuss who the Prescients and stuff are. But I think in this version of the story, in the Sun person, the very idea of humanity is explored because realistically, the clones seem to exhibit much more humane traits than humanity. Like the whole thing with the shooting of the melon and the that kind of stuff, the disregard for life as part of fun is this warped version of humanity that has existed right throughout history, etc., as using others as sport, and that could be people as much as it was animals or anything else. So both the Waylanders in the next story and the clones in this one both exhibit kind of moral codes in ways that humanity doesn't.
That's a great point. I mean, you're right. Like, they're not violent, right? It's like that's the whole notion of or one of the ideas behind AI that I find interesting to discuss and argue is like it's sort of taking for granted that any AI we create will function and think like we do. And I just don't think that's true, right? Like I think it would fundamentally probably be alien. And that means, you know, if it doesn't have to, like a lot of the violence in us comes from, you know, how we evolved, right? The, you know, survival of the fittest
Yes.
sort of
Yes.
situation. And we just haven't outgrown that violent programming, right? The savage, if
The
you will, right?
primal
We've not
nature of it,
evolved
yeah.
past it. But
Yeah.
what if we create something that doesn't have that imperative, right? That is, you know, we have our own programming, right? You know, whether you think it comes from sort of some metaphysical soul or just like neurochemistry or whatever, like there's something inside us that makes us act the way we do, and it unites us all as human beings. And similarly, you know, an AI, if we create it and it is self-aware, you know, what's to say it's going to be violent? Like I just don't think that's necessarily the case. And yeah, if you then clone and genetically engineer these more docile humans, like they're almost better than us because they're not prone to the same destruction.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
Cyberpunk is. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say in Harari's latest book, the philosopher Nexus, he said it shouldn't be artificial intelligence; it should be alien intelligence.
Yeah.
By the time we get to that, and that was just interesting. You mentioned that.
I was going to say Cyberpunk in its very nature generally explores themes of how technological advances create split in humanity and in races. So whether that's in clones or enhancements, like if you want to think about something like Deus Ex or something like that, it's very much the same idea of creating a two-tier humanity. And to your point, I think one of the things that's sort of been explored here is the idea that if we created clones and they got to a point that they could be sentient or gain sentience through this different type of soap that they're using, or the enhanced soap that they say, would the conditions exist within humanity for them not to become violent, i.e. be fighting for their survival? Would we respect that life that we created in such a way that they wouldn't have to? You know, because I still think that technology, etc., would exist the same as a newborn baby, that an awful lot of nurture comes into its existence and its decision making process, if that makes sense, rather than the nature part of it that we've kind of grown up with, and the genetic codes and all of the stuff that comes from the past that's kind of hung on. It's an interesting thought point without ever really exploring it, because I really don't think that's what the book's about, but it does pose a lot of these questions within the story to just kind of let you go and run free with and take in the next story.
I mean, that's a great point. How would nurture affect alien intelligence, artificial intelligence, whatever we want to call it, right? Like, and you know, I think we shouldn't so quickly jump to the answer that they would just become violent. Like maybe they would, but maybe the way they function is so fundamentally anti-violent that, you know, we effectively enslave them and they don't revolt, you know? And then that's entirely on us, right?
Absolutely.
But I mean, there's no guarantee, right? It could go either way. And that's the thing, is always a combination of nature and nurture, right? Just like with human beings, we all have our, you know, genetic code, our ancestry, and then we all have how we were raised and our environments and the people we're around at all times shaping us. And, you know, any animal, any form of life would function the exact same way.
By the end of the story,
next story.
well, I was going to say, by the end of the story, we get a massive cliffhanger, like enormous cliffhanger with his postgrad student that has been sort of helping him, and that is anything but a postgrad student. This has been very much, it feels like they are grooming Sunmi, as we know, going to be presented as God, but it does feel like they are trying to create a situation where they are hiding this clone away, letting them gain knowledge, letting them kind of get existence of the world, kind of experience all the things that are going to happen to it, but keeping it hidden away and safe in ways that weren't just academic research. There seems to be like a bigger another corporation or another kind of idea. We haven't totally got away from the idea of the corporation ruling the world and it's been saved by these good people. It just seems like these are probably just another corporation with a different outcome in mind.
Oh, that's a horrifying thought. I hadn't even thought. I was assuming it was going to be some sort of like ethicist revolutionary, like AI revolution. Like not that like the guy is a revolutionary, but that that like, or not that the guy is an AI, but that he's, you know, a part of a revolutionary group who wants to liberate the clones.
It could well be, but I think the possibility exists that it might not be as well.
That would be very cyberpunk, right? It's very noir. If like in the end, everyone sucks and there are these giant conspiracies, and the conspiracies just unveil new ways in which people suck.
Well, we'll find out next week.
Yeah.
One other thing I'll say, did you not think it was kind of funny that the person that plagiarized his PhD research actually created the whole thing for Sunmi and Yaris, or whatever you call it, Yanni, wasn't it? For them to ascend by accident. Like, I just thought that was kind of like this very beautiful kind of resolution to the story, given that he was an idiot and he really had nothing to do with it, but just so happened.
Yeah.
Anne was painted as this rich boy, you know, that got there only because of privilege.
I kept waiting until the very end for him to have some redeeming quality. Yeah.
Well, then she becomes a god.
Yeah. How did that happen? I am sad now, Carl, that you brought it up, because like I was thinking that she becomes such a great person somehow that she's made into a god in the future. I didn't think of the violent aspect of it, that maybe it's through a horrifying death that she becomes a god. I thought maybe she becomes sort of like the figurehead. Oh, yeah, maybe.
I mean, I think
that
she
seems
maybe
unlikely.
indirectly does. Like, I think she, my guess, my theory is that she does become a figurehead for this revolution that leads to mass violence, humanity destroying itself effectively, and, you know, then the resulting situation we see in Slucia's Crossing. But we know she is executed after this, at least according to
legend or the story.
Yeah, the story, and the, you know, what we're told by the narrator in Slucia's Crossing is she after she is captured, she is executed. Kind of, you know, again, it evokes the story of Jesus Christ, right? Romans captured him, and then
they were talking about deadlands and parts that are no longer habitable. So I guess the apocalypse was in progress during Sonmi's time. I don't know if she maybe sped it up, or if this was just how it ended, with very low population left.
Well,
I think that's a very...
The prescient explains it, doesn't it? Basically saying it was just caused by people not basically accepting that enough was enough, and basically just eating up all the resources that there were, and with no consideration. You know, they were savage rather than civilized, as was explained. You know.
Oh yeah. I love that discussion. It was quite brilliant.
I think it is very realistic to have the apocalypse not be one big explosion, you know, not the nuclear winter that kind of used to be the fear, and, you know, during the Cold War. And, you know, still, I think everyone is still kind of nervous by the concept, but I think in my mind, the much more likely scenario is this kind of slow burn. We, you know, I mean, it's not even you destroy the planet, because the planet will survive, but you make it uninhabitable, or large swaths of it uninhabitable for human beings.
Well, uninhabitable for the amount of humans that we have on the planet at the moment. You know, the resources just aren't there to sustain it. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else kind of thought this while reading this story, but this story very much, if anybody's a gamer, it was very Horizon Zero Dawn. If anybody has played that, there's big parallels between what happened here, and especially when they go up the mountain, etc., in that game, or in the game compared to here. I thought that it was a kind of similar-ish narrative, and I sort of enjoyed that quite a lot, because I think that's a very interesting idea as well, is the apocalyptic after the world has ended, so to speak, and when it's all
I love
almost
that it
reverted
takes
back to
place.
thing.
Yeah, I love that it takes place in Hawaii.
Yeah,
That
that's
was
cool.
such a fun location to set everything. It's so cool, and I'm with you. I love the kind of tropical. Horizon Zero Dawn's a good comparison, and yeah, I love the full circle of it. Kind of reverting to the sort of that tribal, island dynamics that we were exploring in the very first story. It really is kind of beautifully structured, in that way.
Yeah, and the
Even the
language is reverted
location.
as well. Yeah,
Sorry.
location and language
Yeah.
have all reverted.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess does the guy I forget his name, but the one who shows up in Adam Ewing's rope thing, the way he speaks is slightly reminiscent of the language that these guys use,
That's
right?
right. Yeah,
Um,
that's true.
and I was gonna say, wasn't Ewing headed to Hawaii? Like, I think they were going to Maui or something. So even like location-wise, I think we've come a bit full circle.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, our main
That's
character's
so
brother's
cool.
called Adam as well, isn't he?
Yes, I did catch
Mm,
that. Yes.
that's true. Interesting. Yes.
Interesting
There
indeed.
were a lot of biblical names in
Yes.
Sluicious Crossing. Zachary definitely evokes Zachariah, and
I
there
did
was
laugh at one of them.
Abel.
Mwe
Yes.
in the jungle, the might.
That was playing in my head. Yes.
Oh yeah.
Every time I read that, I was Mwe.
I was trying to figure out where did they get, so Somni, obviously we know where she, like, that kind of godhood, like where that tale comes from. Old Georgie, I was trying to think, like in all the stories we've read, is there a George? Is there
I was
someone, or
trying
is
to figure that out. There doesn't seem to be, as far as I know. Unless Timothy Cavendish has a middle name that we don't know.
yeah, I know, I kept looking back, I was like, is it Timothy Cavendish? Is it even older than that?
Yeah.
And maybe it'll
Yeah.
come up in the next one. Maybe it's unrelated, it's just like, this is the devil, like
Like
there's some
old
story
Yeller,
behind it,
or
but we don't know it.
Yeah,
Hmm.
is
You
it
know?
Frobisher? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's there's lots of interesting things in the story. I think in terms of this. Other than the story, they've got the kind of predictive nature of the iconry, etc. Again, very Horizon Zero Dawn. There's a lot of that in there, but I kind of thought at one point that the Prescients were the clones, and then thought maybe the Waylanders were the clones because they're derived, or
Hmm.
their descendants thing. I think one of them is probably descendants of the clones in some ways,
That's interesting.
because of
Yeah.
that. I think
Maybe.
likely the Prescients because of the disease that's taken them, and they can't fight it because they're
Mm.
all the same. If you know what I mean, they come from the same stock. So if they are clones and it's kind of infesting them, there's so few of them left. Again, a very classic sci-fi kind of trope is to have like clones infected or be killed out by basically the same strain of disease, except
Hmm.
that's affecting them. But lots of
Or
interesting questions outside of the story itself.
that conversation between Sonmi and Minjing's clone.
Well, the other robot, yeah,
Where,
yeah,
yeah.
or the
Where he
clone, sorry, should
says once everything's a dead land, the clones will be the purebloods, and because they are more resistant to things than like he's being built to be resistant to fire, for instance. So he thinks that they might survive out better than the humans. But yeah, I like both theories, and I do think it's possible that one of them, like, that crossed my mind as well. I mean, it seems logical that the group that worships Sonmi is descended from her, maybe somehow, but maybe not.
That's actually yeah, I mean, that would feel very karmic if the clones inherited the earth.
The Earth,
Yeah.
yeah. The big question that comes from it, well, there's the two things, because there's the mystical nature of the story, not just Ed Connery, but the fact that time literally stops for Zachary. And he's left with this moment with a voice speaking in his head. And again, right, is that a clone thing? Is that an AI thing? Or what actually is going on with that in some way? And because the story will not return, I've got a feeling we'll never really know. If you know what I mean, because of that, we'll just have to take our own kind of lead from that and our own kind of reading of that.
Who had the? Did anybody have the birthmark in this story?
Yes, the prescient,
Merriman?
or whatever. Yeah, they had the birthmark. Yeah, the prescient had the birthmark.
We find out right at the very end.
Very end.
Yeah.
Oh, Merwin. Yeah, right. Okay.
Merwin.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
My reading of it, my initial thought was, oh, we're getting magic. But I think it's, you refer to this as like it's like a parable. It definitely evokes like folklore, kind of, the stories we tell by mouth.
Yeah.
And I think it's just kind of a literary affectation in that regard. But I think
I took it as that as well. Yeah.
This is Zachary dramatizing his internal turmoil, and that he doesn't literally see old Georgie. Corpses don't literally talk to him. Time doesn't literally stop. But that's kind of what it felt like for him.
Right.
He's a storyteller. He's telling a good story, right? He's not letting truth get in the way of a good story. But I was definitely taken aback at first. I was like, and it's ambiguous, right? We don't know for certain, but that is how I read it, as just kind of this affectation to further the drama.
To that fact, though, isn't it also true that Zachary also ascends by the end of the story? Because he does get past his base instinct, and he gets through his past, conditioning and all of that kind of stuff in much the same way as Sonmi does, and he ascends and makes free choice for himself about what he should be doing and that kind of stuff. Which, again, I think the parallels between some of these stories are really interesting to kind of read between.
Absolutely. Yes.
He also goes through the same realization she does about just how big the world is, and he thinks that the island is a large part of the world. But I think Merenim corrects him on that. But I don't know if he quite registered just how big still. But I wanted to ask about the word orison. I had to look it up. I didn't know it. Apparently, it means prayer, and as far as I can tell, there are no other meanings for it. So I guess it sort of makes sense, not really, but sort of why it's called an orison in the story, in Zachary's story. But they start calling it an orison right in Sonmi's story, like for my orison. Like it's almost like for my interviewer, like for posterity, this is what I'm keeping. So what do you guys think? Why is it a prayer that they are keeping, like whatever she is? I don't know if we'll find out who the interviewer is later on, and therefore we'll find the context. Maybe the priesthood of Sonmi is already forming, and they want to collect this data. But do you guys have thoughts on that? Gimme, Chris.
I do. So it has three functions, the device, doesn't it? It is like a memory device, it's a capture device, and it's a communication device, like almost a predictor. And prayers are sort of all three of those things in their own right. They are communal things that people use to kind of have a group kind of thing together with. They also talk about kind of moral codes and that kind of stuff in the past and how you should live your life, etc. So it sort of is all of those things. I didn't know that that's what Orison was in terms of being a Orison as a prayer, but it does make sense in that thing. And again, we have this look at a piece of very far-flung technology in a world that doesn't have anything. There are basically sticks and stones in a lot of cases in this world, and yet there is this artifact essentially that is used for long distance communications, and that he can't make sense of, even when he goes to the observatory and he experiences electric for the first time, and they discuss airports and they discuss observatories and telescopes and all of that kind of stuff, and we as the reader can recognize that, but our poor character Zachary is so out of his depth in this discussion. He's sort of trusting depression that she's telling the truth, and as part of his ascendance is that acceptance of that there is a world bigger than him out there.
Yeah. Reminds me of Planet of the Apes a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. It's very Planet of the Apes, that kind of part. Yeah.
Talk about a trope I love is in the post-apocalypse where they rediscover old technology, or I love it in fantasy too when it's like rediscovering the old magic or like long lost civilizations. Like there's just something wondrous about that. I love walking in ruins of old. Like I visited Rome several years back, and it's just fantastic, Or walking around the UK and Ireland and seeing like castles, and it's just cool, it feeling that tie to the past is really an awesome thing. And in terms of the orison or orison, however it is said, first of all, I love the word. It looks good on the page. It flows off the tongue. It's just a good word. Thank you for sharing what it meant. I had not looked up what it meant, Varsha, and my feeling is it's almost, prayers are to me are often like requests. It's like someone asking for something, and so maybe it's this. To me, like prayers are in some ways kind of an act of hope, and this egg, as it's described, which is itself, I think, a distinct symbolic way of describing it, is a hope for a better future for the clones. And, in many ways it is, right? And they kind of escape their corpocratic slavery, even though it does come at the cost of. Well, we don't know. I mean, we don't know if that's related to the apocalypse or not. That's unclear at this point.
Who knows?
But it does seem like they were liberated.
Yeah, I do like how the story ended too, with the sit down, listen to my story, because this book has been all about storytelling. And so we actually finally get an ending that we haven't got yet with any other story so far, and so we finally get an ending, and it's the ending is sitting down, tell a story, and I really appreciated that fact right there.
Yeah, because essentially we're probably going to get 5 endings now after this, aren't we? We're going to get ending after ending. So sit down and hear the end of all of these stories. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
We got the name drop too, right? We now understand Cloud Atlas, what that means, where that comes from. That was lovely. And on the topic, very briefly, I want to maybe this will open a new conversation topic as well. But on names, I just looked up Diophysite.
Yes.
I didn't know what that meant, or duophysite. And that is, it looks like the closest thing to duophysite that I can find is diophysite, which it refers to kind of the Christian belief that Jesus Christ contains 2 separate essences, effectively, the human and the divine within him. And it's basically saying it's like a paradox that believing that he is simultaneously human and divine. And that is like kind of the fundamental belief. I mean, you think it's kind of the mainstream belief in most Christian sects.
Christian religions,
is
Father,
my
Son, Holy Spirit,
And so that's an interesting name for the prescient to have, I think. I'll have to like think about that one. But I just wanted to highlight that while we were sharing definitions.
It definitely feels like very little is by accident in this. It's a very...
Not at all, yeah.
It sort of brings up one of the things that strikes my mind is because, like, when I go into the bookshop or I go in the library, Cloud Atlas is definitely in the literary fiction section.
Yeah.
Like, very strongly in the literary fiction section. But it's not a hair's breadth from Parable of Talents, Parable of Solar, both in terms of themes, the way that it goes about it, any of those things. It's very clearly a sci-fi book in a lot of ways, like because it has that element, but yet it doesn't get labeled as such. And maybe it is this extra layer or something that it has in terms of the kind of relatableness of a lot of the thematic iconography, the names, all of that kind of stuff. This thing's been unfair, but I just think it's a bit weird that this isn't a
Yeah.
sci-fi book, if you know what I mean, because it is sci-fi, but very clearly a sci-fi book to me.
Yeah. It's the whole label thing in marketing, and
It's
Yeah.
strange, isn't
it drives me nuts because, it's I don't know who decided that it's going to go in that section. You know what I mean? And what was their marketing goal? That's all it is. Is what was their goal in marketing to put it in that section?
But I think this is a book that I could give to my sister who reads a lot of like general fiction and say and read it and she'd go, "Oh God, I really enjoyed that." But if it had been what is it, and she say, "Oh, it's a sci-fi book," she'll not go near it either. Do you know what I mean? It's a very it's a misunderstood kind of part of literature that kind of most stories, and I kind of thought this when reading Jenner recently. It's a fantasy story, in a lot of ways. To us now,
Or a horror story.
And you could give it to you could tell somebody it's a sci-fi book, and they'll read the first section and go, "What are you giving me? This is historical fiction. What are you giving me this for?"
indeed. Exactly right. It is a book that kind of does defy labels because of its different sections and things within it, but I think it does bring an interesting conversation with the Cloud Atlas.
Yeah, and maybe they threw it in literary fiction because it was because he's obviously playing with different genres and different styles, and that was part of his purpose. It seemed to even write this, and that he wanted to play with different genres, and so it's that's probably just a catch-all that sits where it does in the in the bookstore.
Yeah, it is. It's one of those where it's like when you really drill down to it, it's not clean cut at all. And my understanding is David Mitchell does a lot of genre blending and like including kind of fantastical and sci-fi elements in all his books, but all of his stuff is shelved in literary. And maybe that just comes down to it's not even the prose, because I can think of like a fantasy book I didn't finish, but that I was reading earlier this year, Spear Cuts Through Water, that has very unique, very colorful, very dense prose. And actually its writing style was what I struggled with the most, and why I didn't finish it is I just had a hard time emotionally investing in the story.
Really? I was all over that one. I love that book.
Yeah, and most people do who've read it, and that's why I picked it up, was seeing the immense praise. And maybe I'll return to it, maybe in a different mood, because I'm definitely a mood reader. It'll click right for me.
But this book, like we're talking about all this cool stuff and this great stuff that's going on in this book, but I did not enjoy reading these last two sections. I recognize how brilliant they are, and I recognize a lot of the cool stuff he's doing and a lot of the great stuff that's going on, but I didn't, especially the last section, the middle section here, I didn't really enjoy reading it. I found it, I don't like that kind of
it's difficult,
that kind of writing, where he's making up this future language that has devolved in some ways, but is and he's trying to write it like that, and he's very good at it and very accurate with it for what it is, but it wasn't enjoyable for me to read, other than occasionally going, "Oh, okay, there's something with that, and there's something with that," and so this book is quite interesting. It's quirky as hell.
Yeah.
I can't wait to get to some of the other sections. I'm looking forward to them, because I enjoyed some of the other sections a lot.
Yeah, I would not be able to read a whole book written, like, frankly, either one of these two sections. I would find it extremely difficult. But what did surprise me was I felt like I really kind of got into a flow, into a rhythm with Sluicious Crossing, where I followed it and like read it at a pretty decent pace. Occasionally kind of having to stop to be like, what were, like, the one that really got me was Babbit once I realized that meant babies. And I was just like, okay. For some reason, that one really took me aback.
Yeah.
But, and there's a lot of interesting slang like that. But a lot of it I found very actually like, while it is different and a lot of like mixing words together and, blending language in interesting ways, I actually found a lot of it like kind of, it wasn't too difficult to parse. Like I was like, oh, that's what that slang word means. Like that, like I was impressed. This is what I'm getting at. Is I was impressed that he created this entire new version of English that to me was actually legible. Like I like it was easier to follow than a lot of like sci-fi I've read that has like the most insane slang you've ever read. And it felt more natural, maybe is what it was. That like again, like I couldn't read a whole book written like this, but like I actually found it like I was like, oh, I know what he's saying here. Like that's but it still feels alien, and I found that really impressive. Beyond that, I did get emotionally invested in this one when again we got into the love story. I guess I'm a sucker for love stories. That's always been kind of where I've locked in, and maybe it's partially because we have this grander narrative of this, like it seems like this star-crossed lovers across time is kind of what I'm reading into this, and it their adventure, I was captivated. And the question of whether or not he was going to kill her, I was on the edge of my seat. But there also definitely were times like again the opening of this when his dad gets killed and his brother gets enslaved. I just didn't give a shit. Like I was like, oh, that's shocking. I don't care.
Exactly right. But I think it's
the
put there.
ending, I don't know.
I think it's put there for that reason, though, Carl, because it kind of explains his character rather than us being emotionally invested. You know what I mean? And I think that has got to be intentional because it's honestly like so that's sort of the rules of engagement of this world, so to speak, rather than necessarily a tragedy.
I also loved, that they got into what is clearly like the thematic core of it and talking about a lot of the things that were subtext before that became text, where they're talking about like savagery and civilization and, that, we are all savages and civilized, and it's kind of up to how we act in the moment, which is something that's a thematic observation that I find not only it rings very true for me, but it's one I actually write a lot in my own fiction because I think it's so easy. We so tend to generalize as like, oh, this group of people is savage or this group of people is civilized, when like I really feel like when you drill down, it's like it's in all of us as individual. I mean, I guess that's humanism is really what that is, but we all have the animal inside of us, the beast that wants to lash out and kill or be killed.
Yeah, but Mitchell makes it clear that it's nothing to do with race and it's nothing to do with color.
Exactly,
It's very much about culture maybe and nurture, that kind of discussion again that we had between the Kona and then the Waylanders. They're basically the same race, but they approach things very, very differently in how they go about it. Yeah.
There's also a bit of exploration of, I don't know if cultural relativism is the right term, but the bit where Meronim's people, they refuse to sell them technology that they don't already have or wouldn't already have developed themselves. Like, we're not going to give you smarts that you don't already have. And then Meronim has to struggle with deciding whether or not to save his sister because she knows she can, but I guess like she's got orders from above to not interfere and sort of study the
Prime
culture from
directive.
the outside, I suppose.
Prime directive.
Yeah.
It's the prime directive version. Like, I don't know what else to say this.
Oh, right. Yeah. It's a Star Wars thing.
Star Trek
Trek.
pervades a lot of science fiction for the rest of eternity because of the ideas that it kind of puts in there. Which, ironically, I will say, the short stories coming up, they talk about Starfleet and that as well, and I was like, oh, Jesus, what the hell's going on here?
There's literally the word Star Wars mentioned in Amphidy.
Yeah, so interesting.
Yeah, and I know we've sort of moved on past that a long while ago now, but the ending of the story when he says, "Open your hands, look," that one word is so powerful as an ending.
Yeah.
Look,
Great
that
ending.
Yeah, I mean, he is asking them to look at the orison. I think he's showing them that, but in the sense of like, it's almost got this air of, here, hold my beer. Now I'm going to show you what I'm going to do with these stories. I don't know if they live up to him. I don't remember, but it yeah.
Wasn't it beautiful that the last little section was his descendants and his kids?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like showing
Yeah.
you that life did go on for him, like very subtly, like in a very clever way, just to say that wasn't the end of that race and those people. They thought their dad was a crazy old coot, but actually he had multiple children, you know, and I
It's
think
a
that's
very
beautiful.
hopeful ending. Like
Yeah.
I was glad to see that despite it's an apocalypse, like life does go on and humanity survives and endures. And okay, another theory just came to me.
And continues to tell stories in
continues
in
to
the
tell
way
stories,
that
right?
Yeah.
humans do. Yeah.
Yeah, to do the things that makes us unique, right? Theory. I think the reason this is the last story is because this is when the lovers actually fully get to like consummate their love and like complete it, and like they end up together, right? In this story, Marinim and Zachary,
Yeah.
and you know they have kids together, and I think because they get to settle down together and have their happy ending, because that's what this is. It's like a happy ending.
Yeah.
I
Very
think
much so.
I my guess is that is why this is the last story, is because their story is kind of at its end. They have reached their ending, and all the other timelines, it's going to continue to be like zigzagging across each other, never quite getting to have their happy ending. That's my theory. That's the shit I'm throwing at the wall.
I haven't seen, like, this is the first proper romance part I think that I've seen through the stories, if you know what I mean, and like a reluctant romance, but with very obviously a very big time difference between the two of them, the age gap between them, etc. But that definitely is like it's a romance built on respect and admiration and of mutual in both ways of both people, and that they do things and step outside their normal boundaries or the way that they've been conditioned and nurtured to do. And that is interesting. That's something to look forward to for the rest, because I hadn't totally picked up on that card, which is nice.
It's been in the background, and honestly,
Yeah.
I'm going to be full transparency. I think I don't remember anything that happens in the movie, but I vaguely remember in the movie love echoing across time being
Okay.
like one of the plot points. And so that may be entirely where I'm getting this from. Although I do think love, the kind of romance, plays in a background role in a lot of these stories that I think is maybe most apparent in the transition between the Gothic one and Louisa Ray, where it's like these two souls that seemingly cross paths, you know, that loved each other, but they're not aware then that even like after one of them dies and is seemingly reincarnated, they then cross paths again. So that's kind of the origin point, because like in the first story I couldn't begin to point at a romance story.
Well, it is, yeah,
but
it does happen. But it also would be very Hollywood screenwriterish adaptation to inject a love element or a romance element
True.
into a narrative as well, to kind of, or try to draw that out as well. So that could also be true. But interesting, definitely, for sure, to kind of monitor as we're going through.
I think I know the answer to that. I'm going to keep quiet because we'll read and find out. But suppose that there is no love story and it's just one person being reincarnated over and over. What do you guys think that like what do you think the underlying theme there is? Because the love one is sort of, I don't know about the theme exactly, but it's sort of like uplifting to think like of these two people finding each other over and over again. But if it's just one person living these many lives, and I think Zachary has an experience with a drug when, like, the night before he gets kidnapped, where he apparently sees all his past lives and his people believe in reincarnation. So what do you guys think that the deeper theme could be in the case where it is just one person living their many lives?
Interesting question. I don't know, it wasn't rhetorical, but it might end up being rhetorical.
I mean, the closest I could come to guessing is kind of the title of the book and the cloud atlas of it all, that it's kind of explained that like souls are clouds, and to understand them, to map them, right, it's like to understand that they can come into different forms and different shapes, and they're constantly changing, even though there is some part of them that is the same. And I think we see that in all the characters, about how all the reincarnated versions of the same cloud, right, the same soul, are all very different people, with very different motivations and stories.
That's interesting, because really clouds never really go away. They form into something else. They
Right.
turn into rain. They form again, but it's all the same material. It's all the same. So that's interesting. I like
Yeah,
that.
they float through
It's
life and float
poetic.
through existence at different times. Yeah. It's a lovely metaphor, isn't it?
One thing I will say that I think all of the comet tattooed people
Yes.
have in common is they all lie to get around. Like, they're all liars. Some of them are much more noble about it, but they're like not telling the truth. Actually, with the exception of Adam, I feel like Adam is dangerously honest and doesn't know how to lie. But like you think of like all the other characters, like what's his Frobisher. His entire story is about an elaborate lie he tells.
Yeah,
Louisa
that's right.
Ray has to lie her way around as a PI. Timothy Cavendish is just full of lies, and lies to himself about who he is, really. I mean, he's just one all big lie. And then I'm losing it with Sonmi, actually. So maybe I'm full of shit. I'm trying to think of how she could lie, but nope.
But we haven't got to the end of that story either. So
right,
maybe
yeah,
their life's a lie, maybe in so much as what they thought their existence was, etc. There are definitely possibilities in that way.
Well, maybe her being a goddess is going to be a lie. So
somebody wrote a story to say that they were a goddess, but they never were. It's kind of
maybe that's the lie. She decides she deifies herself.
Yeah.
I do wonder the part where Sonmi, like when Zachary finds the orison and he sees Sonmi's picture and he thinks that there's a haunting quality to it. I thought for a moment that very much resembled how the Louisa Ray's feelings were described when she found the letters that Frobisher wrote Sixsmith, and she felt like she had all these memories. Like we didn't see any recap of memories for Zachary, but the sort of being drawn into it, that aspect of it, I thought we were going to find out that Zachary is the reincarnated or is the comet birthmark bearer, but it did not go in that direction. So yeah, I think there might be something after all to the two people finding each other. Either that or just, he's haunted by old technology, old/new to him technology. It could be as simple as that, but I feel like it meant more than just that.
He said he got his Sonmi at last, right? Like there was some union of lovers that couldn't have each other over the centuries. And I mean, on top of that, I just feel like, if we were watching strictly one person reincarnated over and over again, why wouldn't they be the POV every time?
Yeah.
If the story wasn't larger than that one person, that's why I think last time I mentioned like maybe as many as 3 or 4, but I'm increasingly thinking it's just 2 people that were like watching their love story through a lot of different, it's like the background. And my guess would be it comes to the foreground in the last half of the book, now that we've seen the love story's happy ending.
If this book turns into This Is How We Lose the Time, where I'm gonna be so pissed. I'm gonna be so pissed.
Did you not like how This Is How We Lose the Time?
I am not a fan of This Is How We Lose the Time.
I loved it.
I love it.
And with the way you were talking, I would almost certainly say that you were. Yeah.
Oh, you romantic fools, you.
And I usually
love
do, like I've said, I usually do gravitate towards a romance story as much as anybody. But the problems I have with that book are actually not with the romance, if it makes sense. It's much more about the moving nature of location and the center. It's not centered anywhere when for the reader and stuff. But yeah, you know,
It is a very schizophrenic novella. I love it.
I love the
But
way time was described in those books, the strands of time and braiding through it
yeah.
and climbing through it. I'll shut up, but I loved that book.
not a fan. But could reread it and love it, you know. Maybe it
Mm.
is one of those things because it is such a short book. It would capture a specific mood singularly, you know, across reading it. Whereas you know, something like Cloud Atlas, you're going to read over a couple of weeks or whatever.
That's true.
I'm
Cool.
so glad we're not just like reading this in like a week or two. Like if I had powered through this, I would be struggling a lot more. It would be a lot harder to pick up on a lot of the details and like to really like give this the mental effort it deserves.
It adds a lot stopping, forcing a stop,
That is,
discussing and using other people's ideas as a
Yes.
springboard. It changes
Yeah.
the reading experience quite a lot.
That is why Vasha forces us to do this.
Yes, I do it for you. I do it for all of you. Hails on me.
It's why I look forward to it's why I look forward to every Friday. It's like I get to read more. I get allowed to read the next chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
You get the blessing to move forward.
Plus we tend to read very good books, I have to say.
That's true.
Yeah, they're pretty good.
We've most likely got Absolution coming up next, right? I'm excited for that. And are we ready to talk about the Astronaut
Astronaut.
by... Oh man, I have
Sure.
this open.
Valentina
Valentina.
It's Jared's turn.
Zhuravlyova.
Thank you. Yes. This is a very sweet story. Well,
Sweet
not
story.
sweet, but
But a guy
enjoy it.
starving and dying at the end. I mean, you're wow.
I mean,
I
it was
mean-
a story about how wonderful he was to do that. It's...
F the captain, yeah.
Yes.
What a great guy.
What a great guy. And what a sensible, sweet, morally upright guy. Chris, summary?
Yes. We're
Oh
getting
yeah,
there.
that's the summary.
So I
There we
might
go.
have to do this one, but off the top of my head.
Ooh.
So it's a story of a mission in space, whereby they travel out in space to do a scientific research project to Barnaby Star, I believe, is the place that they're going. And
Barnaby
they
Star.
realize as they're going along that they're not going to have enough fuel to get back. So the story explores about what a research mission should do in that case, and then about the kind of sacrifices that each person will make. It's sort of very slimmed down Martian. It's the Martian slimmed down.
Yeah.
Oh, I was that captain. What was his name again? I forget his name, but to me, he was like he was Captain Kirk.
It
And
was Captain Kirk. He was
he
very,
was like,
very much.
"We're gonna figure this out, troops. We're gonna do this.
Trust me.
Trust me. We're gonna figure
I
it out."
believe in people. I don't believe in destiny. I believe in the power of humanity. It's almost the opposite of Cloud Atlas in a lot of ways.
And then
Wait,
he's
did you like go chest beating like a... Is that
and then he's like,
Oh, nice.
and then he's like this super upstanding guy who sacrifices himself for the good of all, and
But it is basically the story of somebody's heroic sacrifice. Like that's pretty much the end of the day for the betterment of other people, and that he will guide them home through rough times and ability not to help themselves, and use the last of his energy to push them through and get home on a planet.
What I found interesting was the fact that they came up with this 12th protocol or whatever it was, where people had to have a hobby in order to get on the spaceship. If you don't have a hobby, you're not accepted. And I was like, "Oh, take me! I got 20 hobbies. All right."
Yeah.
I can't do the thing you actually want, but I've got a ton of hobbies.
I'm
Is
all
that it?
hobby.
It's actually how they cast reality shows. This
Mm.
show predates casting reality shows. So we get this mix of people together, and like the traders. Yeah.
But it's interesting that it came from a Russian writer's perspective.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
That that you had to have the hobby in order to get on the crew. But this was written in 1960, I believe, and tells you how times have changed, I guess, huh?
Some of the science isn't great in it, I have to say. Even from my very pigeon kind of understanding of how fuel will work in space for propulsion, I thought this isn't great, but also I can forgive it. It was sort of written predating a lot of that knowledge, so to speak.
Yeah. I don't know. Is there? It read pretty quickly, and it was about a very decent guy, and
Yes.
that I like the style in which it was told. Like she's making her way through, although it got a little bit old when it was repeated a few times. That she's making her way through some archives, and then she's like, "Oh, I can imagine it. This is how it must have gone down." And then we get a sort of present tense narrative of that. But I liked it the first time, but the second time I was like, okay. But it was a good way to tell the story, I think, and it read really quickly. I enjoyed it.
It was very enjoyable. I have to say there wasn't, maybe because it has been replaced by more fleshed out versions of this story for the third time, the Martian. It doesn't maybe have the impact that it maybe had in 1960, but it was still very enjoyable to read.
Yep. Yeah. Very much. So, anything else about the story before we wrap it up?
No, I think it was, like you said, it was easy read, quick. It read quick, enjoyable. Nothing much more than that, really. It just it gave you this space adventure type of Lost in Space feel, and ended with the ultimate sacrifice.
Yeah. If I have one criticism
noble.
of it, it's the fact that he created all these archetypes of a doctor, an psychiatrist, etc., and never really used them. Do you know what I mean? It was like, it was almost set up at the start, like the doctor is the smartest person on the board. She's going to come up with a revelation at the end, and it didn't really play out that way. But maybe that was, that's for
true.
the novel. But it's enjoyable all the same.
I also got slightly hung up on details like what will he eat? How will he keep himself warm if there's only ice in the world?
Yes. 14 years he had to survive. Like he probably looked around and went, "I'm not eating that shit again today." I mean, that's not good. Can't do that for 14 years. Let's just die.
I guess they did have some sort of greenhouse thing set up. So yeah, I see the Martian comparison, but also yeah, and he had to keep himself alive for 14 years, right? Because he had to like help the ship through. So that part of the planning, I got hung up on the details. So you're not thinking about this. You should.
But the Martian was also where they went. The 18% of fuel left to get home. We've just got to strip the weight out of this entire spacecraft. Like that is exactly what happened in the Martian as well. Mark Watney does exactly all of those things. In a lot of ways. But the one thing that I did like, actually, again, very 1960s computers, the very heavy electronics. They were the worst part of the rocket, was the electronics. And I went, oh, that's fun.
Yep.
Yeah.
Strip the electronics and most of the food. Leave them behind for the captain. Yeah. Okay. Good story.
That's cool.
We'll read The Squid Chooses Its Own Ink by Adolfo Bioy Cesares. Okay. And
nice.
Cazares. Yeah. Anyway, that's what we'll be reading next week. And we'll read the second half of An Origin of Sonmi 451 and The Ghastly Ordeal of Timothy Cavendish. We are moving forward in this book. The book after that will
or moving back.
Or moving back,
yeah.
Yes.
Bravo.
Nice. The book after that will most likely be Absolution by Jeff Vandermeer. We're going to finish that series up with that book. And yeah, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you soon. Bye.